Inflation. It's that silent thief that can erode your savings, increase the cost of living, and create uncertainty in the economy. Governments around the world try to manage it through a combination of fiscal and monetary policies. But what happens when a government fails to address the issue effectively? Today, we're diving into the Trump administration's approach to inflation and why it fell short. One of the most significant fiscal moves under President Trump was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. This legislation reduced corporate tax rates and provided temporary tax cuts for individuals. The goal? Stimulate economic growth. But there was a catch. By injecting more money into the economy without balancing it with reduced government spending, these tax cuts risked overheating the economy. More money chasing the same amount of goods and services often leads to inflation. Critics argued that the tax cuts weren't targeted enough to counter inflation and were more about boosting short-term consumer spending and corporate profits. Now, combine those tax cuts with increased federal spending, particularly on defense, and you get a ballooning budget deficit. The federal deficit went from around $585 billion in 2016 to over $1 trillion by the end of 2019. High deficit spending, especially when the economy is already near full employment, can increase aggregate demand without a corresponding increase in supply, leading to inflation. But the Trump administration showed little interest in reducing the deficit, effectively limiting its ability to maneuver economically in times of downturn or inflation spikes. Then came the pandemic. The Trump administration supported various stimulus measures, such as direct payments to individuals and increased unemployment benefits. These measures were necessary to support those hit hard by the economic shutdowns, but they also injected massive liquidity into the economy. The lack of a phased or conditional stimulus strategy raised concerns. Critics argued that without a clear plan to manage the long-term economic impact, this flood of cash could lead to rising inflation as demand outpaced supply during the recovery. Let's talk about monetary policy. Now, while the Federal Reserve operates independently, the Trump administration's interactions with the Fed had significant implications. Trump publicly pressured the Fed to keep interest rates low, even criticizing it when it considered raising rates. Why? Because low interest rates often stimulate economic growth and boost stock market performance. But keeping rates too low for too long can lead to inflation, as it increases the amount of money circulating in the economy. This constant pressure may have undermined the Fed's independence and made it more difficult for them to act decisively against inflation. Effective economic management requires coordination between fiscal and monetary policies. But under Trump, we saw a disconnect. The administration's lack of a coherent strategy for inflation, combined with an adversarial stance towards the Fed, created uncertainty. Without proper coordination, it's much harder to manage inflation effectively. The Trump administration's broader economic ideology focused heavily on growth, deregulation, and pro-business policies. While these policies aimed to spur economic activity, they often overlooked inflation risks. For instance, deregulation can reduce costs and stimulate investment, but it can also lead to speculative behavior and asset bubbles. Without safeguards, these risks are ignored, potentially leading to inflation in sectors like real estate and finance. Inflation isn't just about short-term gains, it's about sustainable economic stability. The Trump administration's approach, focusing on tax cuts, increased spending, deregulation, and pressuring for low interest rates, failed to provide a comprehensive plan for managing inflation. As the pandemic unfolded, these shortcomings became even more evident. The lack of strategic planning and the failure to address inflation risks left the economy vulnerable. Moving forward, it's clear that any administration needs a more balanced approach, one that considers fiscal discipline, respects the independence of monetary authorities, and ensures that economic growth is both robust and sustainable. In conclusion, managing inflation requires careful coordination of fiscal and monetary policies. The Trump administration's lack of a comprehensive plan highlights the importance of strategic economic planning. As we look to the future, we must learn from these experiences to build a more resilient and balanced economy.